At a sunny Saturday flea market, Sarah and Mike thought they'd found the perfect travel companions. Two vintage leather backpacks, weathered but sturdy, priced at $20 each by an elderly seller who seemed eager to be rid of them. The couple had been planning their cross-country hiking trip for months, and these bags would add character to their adventure. Back in their apartment, as they began cleaning the dusty interiors, their excitement turned to confusion, then horror. The first backpack contained a journal with entries written in dried blood. The second held photographs of missing persons from decades past, along with newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances. Strange symbols were carved into the leather lining and tucked in a hidden pocket. They found a map marked with locations that made their blood run cold. What happened to the people who owned these backpacks? And why were they so desperate to get rid of them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the first Polaroid photograph up to the lamplight. The image showed a young woman with shoulder-length auburn hair, probably in her early 20s, smiling at the camera while standing next to a hiking trail marker. What made Sarah's stomach lurch wasn't the woman's bright, trusting expression, but the red X drawn across her face in what looked suspiciously like the same dried substance that filled the journal's pages. "Mike, look at this," she whispered, her voice barely audible in their small apartment. "There's a date on the back, July 15th, 1987. Mike set down the blood-stained journal he'd been carefully examining and moved closer to his girlfriend. At 28, he prided himself on being logical, analytical. His engineering background had taught him to approach problems systematically, but nothing in his education had prepared him for this moment. The photograph Sarah held was one of 17 they'd found tucked between the journal's pages, each showing a different person, each marked with that same ominous red X. "Here's another one," Sarah said, pulling out a photo of a bearded man in his 30s wearing a flannel shirt and a confident grin. "David Chen disappeared August 3rd, 1989. She turned it over to read the handwritten notation. "Says here he was last seen on the Appalachian Trail near Harper's Ferry." Mike took the photo, studying the man's face. There was something unsettling about how normal, how alive these people looked, knowing that someone had collected their images like trophies. "We need to check if these are real missing persons cases," he said, already reaching for his laptop. The next hour passed in tense silence as they worked. Mike searched missing persons databases, while Sarah carefully catalogued each photograph, creating a spreadsheet with names, dates, and locations when the information was available. The results were chilling. Every single person they could identify had indeed been reported missing, their cases still unsolved decades later. "This can't be coincidence," Sarah murmured, staring at her screen. "Look at this. Jennifer Walsh disappeared 1991. The Charlie Project website has her exact photo. Same girl, same smile, same hiking clothes." Mike's engineering mind tried to process the implications logically, but the pieces formed a picture he didn't want to accept. "Someone was collecting these people," he said slowly. "But why keep photos? Why document it like this?" Sarah opened the journal again, this time forcing herself to read the entries despite their disturbing nature. The handwriting was careful, methodical, almost scholarly in its precision. Each entry began with a date and location, followed by detailed observations about the subject's behavior, physical characteristics, and what the writer called their spiritual readiness. "Listen to this," she said, her voice growing stronger as her academic training kicked in. Sarah had completed her master's degree in anthropology, and despite the horrific content, she recognized the structure of field notes. Subject exhibits optimal fear response. Isolation protocol successful. Preparation for final ceremony scheduled for new moon. Final ceremony? Mike's face went pale. "Sarah, we're not dealing with some random serial killer. This sounds like ritual murder." They returned their attention to the second backpack, which had yielded the map and newspaper clippings. The map was hand-drawn on what appeared to be aged parchment, showing parts of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and West Virginia. Red dots marked specific locations, each accompanied by symbols that resembled no alphabet either of them recognized. Some dots had dates beside them, stretching from 1985 to what appeared to be just 2 years ago. The newspaper clippings told the same story from a different angle. Headlines like "Local hiker still," "Missing after 2 weeks," and "Search called." "Off for missing camper" created a timeline of disappearances that matched the photos and journal entries with disturbing accuracy. As Mike studied the symbols carved into the leather lining of both backpacks, he noticed they weren't random scratches but deliberate markings, deep and precise. Some appeared to be astronomical symbols, others resembled ancient religious iconography he vaguely remembered from a comparative religion course in college. "We should call the police," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "And tell them what? That we bought evidence of serial murders at a flea market." Mike shook his head. "They'll think we're crazy, or worse, that we're involved somehow." Sarah was about to respond when her phone rang. The caller ID showed only a string of numbers she didn't recognize. She let it ring until it stopped, but within seconds it started again. "Same unknown number." "Don't answer it," Mike said, noticing her hesitation, but Sarah was already reaching for the phone. "Hello?" Silence. Then the sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. "Who is this?" she demanded. The line went dead. Immediately, Mike's phone began ringing. Different number, but when he answered, the same pattern: silence, breathing, then nothing. They stared at each other across their coffee table. The photographs and journals spread between them like evidence at a crime scene. Outside their apartment window, the cheerful Saturday afternoon continued unchanged, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. "How did they get our numbers?" Sarah whispered. Sarah spread the hand-drawn map across their kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs to keep the aged parchment flat. Under the bright overhead light, the red dots and strange symbols seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Mike sat beside her, cross-referencing the marked locations with Google Maps on his laptop, his face growing more troubled with each match he found. "Here's the first one," he said, pointing to a red dot near what appeared to be a state park boundary. "Michaud State Forest, about 50 miles south of here. The coordinates match exactly." He clicked through satellite images, zooming in on the remote area. "It's way off the main trails, maybe 2 miles from the nearest parking area." Sarah traced her finger along the map's carefully drawn topographical lines. The cartographer had possessed genuine skill, rendering elevation changes and water sources with remarkable accuracy. This wasn't the work of an amateur. "Look at the date," she said. "This location has 3 different entries. 1987, 1991, and 1998. Whatever happened there, it happened multiple times." The symbols surrounding each location defied easy interpretation. Some resembled astronomical signs, others looked like corrupted versions of religious iconography. One symbol appeared consistently near every marked site, a circle bisected by 3 wavy lines, with small dots arranged in a specific pattern around the perimeter. Mike had been researching the symbol online for the past hour, diving deep into occult databases and academic papers on comparative religion. "I think I found something," he said, turning his laptop screen towards Sarah. "It's called a soul anchor. According to this paper from the University of Pennsylvania's folklore department, it was used in certain pre-Christian rituals to bind spiritual energy to physical locations." Spiritual energy? Sarah's anthropological training made her skeptical of supernatural explanations, but the evidence before them was pushing the boundaries of rational analysis. "You mean like ghosts?" "More like spiritual batteries," Mike said, reading from the academic text. The theory was that traumatic death could release psychic energy that, properly channeled, could be stored and used for various purposes. It's mentioned in several European folk traditions, but the practice supposedly died out centuries ago. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the apartment's air conditioning. "Supposedly," They returned their attention to the map, identifying 6 locations within a 100-mile radius of their apartment. The furthest was in West Virginia, marked with the most complex symbol cluster and dated just 2 years ago. Each site appeared to be in remote wilderness areas, far from hiking trails or camping grounds where disappearances might be quickly noticed. "We could drive to the closest one," Sarah said suddenly. "Michaud State Forest. We could see what's actually there." Mike stared at her. "Are you insane?" "Sarah, we're talking about crime scenes. Multiple murders. We should take this to the FBI. With what? A map that could be completely fictional. Photos that might be fake. A journal written in what we think is blood, but could be anything." Sarah stood up, pacing to the window. "We need proof. Real evidence. Something that will make them take us seriously instead of dismissing us as conspiracy theorists. Or we could get ourselves killed," Mike countered, but Sarah could see him wavering. His engineering mind was already working through the logistics, calculating risks and benefits despite his better judgment. "One location," Sarah pressed. "We drive out there in daylight, take some photos, see if there's anything actually there. If we find evidence of real crimes, then we go to the authorities." Mike closed his laptop and studied the map again. The Michaud site was marked with what appeared to be GPS coordinates written in the margin. Whoever had created this map had wanted the locations to be found, at least by someone with the knowledge to interpret the symbols. "We go armed," he said finally, "and we tell someone where we're going." "Agreed." Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the decision. "We'll leave early tomorrow morning, be back before dark." As they began planning their expedition, neither of them noticed the figure standing across the street from their apartment building. The elderly man who had sold them the backpacks stood motionless in the shadow of an oak tree, his eyes fixed on their third-floor window. In his gnarled hand, he clutched a small object that glinted occasionally in the streetlight, a pendant identical to the symbol that appeared on every location marked on their map. He had been watching them for hours, waiting to see what they would do with his burden. The backpacks had been his desperate attempt to pass the responsibility to someone else, to break the chain that had bound him for 43 years. But the artifacts had their own will, their own purpose, and they would not be so easily abandoned. The old man smiled, but there was no joy in the expression, only the satisfaction of a trap successfully set. Tomorrow, Sarah and Mike would begin their journey into the heart of something ancient and hungry. They believed they were investigators pursuing justice for the dead. They had no idea they were walking directly into the predator's carefully constructed web. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural. Sarah and Mike had hiked for nearly 2 hours through Michaud State Forest, following the GPS coordinates from the map. But the usual sounds of wildlife had gradually faded until they walked through a bubble of absolute quiet. Even their footsteps seemed muffled, as if the earth itself was absorbing sound. "This can't be right," Mike said, checking his handheld GPS unit for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "According to this, we should be right on top of the coordinates, but there's nothing here." Sarah surveyed their surroundings. They stood in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth oak and pine trees, their branches creating a natural cathedral overhead. Filtered sunlight created patterns on the forest floor, but something about the light seemed wrong. Too pale, too cold for a summer afternoon. "Wait," Sarah said, pointing to a section of ground that looked different from the rest. "Look at that area. The soil's a different color." They approached cautiously. A roughly circular patch of earth, maybe 15 feet in diameter, was noticeably darker than the surrounding forest floor. No grass grew within the circle, no wildflowers, no undergrowth. Just bare, dark soil that looked as if it had been recently turned. Mike knelt and dug his fingers into the earth. It came away easily, almost eagerly, and he immediately jerked his hand back. "It's warm," he said, staring at the soil clinging to his fingers. "The ground is actually warm." Sarah pulled a small trowel from her backpack and began digging more systematically. She had excavated archaeological sites during graduate school, and recognized the signs of deliberately buried objects. 6 inches down, her trowel struck something hard. "There's something here," she said, carefully clearing away the dark soil. What emerged made them both step backward. It was bone, yellowed with age, but unmistakably human. A femur, by Sarah's estimation, but carved with the same symbols they'd seen in the backpacks. The bone had been hollowed out and shaped into a whistle, with finger holes precisely drilled along its length. "Jesus Christ," Mike breathed. "That's someone's leg bone." Sarah forced herself to examine the artifact professionally, despite the revulsion crawling up her spine. The carving work was sophisticated, almost artistic in its precision. This wasn't the crude work of a madman, but the careful craftsmanship of someone with genuine skill and purpose. "There's more," she said, continuing to dig. They uncovered a collection of objects buried in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement. Carved bones, small metal talismans, and at the center, a circle of stones blackened by repeated exposure to fire. Mike was photographing everything with his phone when they heard the footsteps. Heavy boots crunching through dry leaves, approaching from the direction they'd come. Sarah and Mike froze, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how far from help. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, as if whoever approached knew exactly where to find them. A man emerged from the tree line, and Sarah's blood went cold. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like a lumberjack, and a graying beard that reached halfway down his chest. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they fixed on the couple with unmistakable hostility. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground. "This is private property." "We're sorry," Mike said, standing slowly, his hands visible. "We didn't see any posted signs. We're just hiking." The man's gaze shifted to the excavated artifacts, and his expression darkened further. "Hiking," he repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. "With archaeological tools. Digging up sacred ground." Sarah tried to project calm confidence, drawing on her academic experience dealing with hostile landowners at dig sites. "We're researchers," she said. "We have permission from the State Park Service to conduct historical surveys in this area." It was a lie, but she delivered it with conviction. The man studied her for a long moment, then stepped closer to examine their excavation. When he saw the bone whistle, something changed in his expression. The hostility was replaced by something worse, recognition and fear. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, backing away from the circle. "No idea what you've awakened. What do you mean?" Sarah asked, but the man was already turning to leave. "Get out," he said over his shoulder. "Get out now and don't come back. Bury that thing and pretend you never found it. If you're smart, you'll burn those backpacks and forget they ever existed." "How do you know about the backpacks?" Mike called after him, but the man had already disappeared into the forest, moving with surprising stealth for someone his size. Sarah and Mike stood alone in the clearing, the bone whistle gleaming pale in the filtered sunlight. Around them, the unnatural silence seemed to press closer, and Sarah could swear she felt something watching them from the shadows between the trees. "We need to go," Mike said. But Sarah was already carefully wrapping the whistle in a cloth from her pack. "We're taking this with us," she said. "It's evidence." As they hurried back through the forest, neither of them noticed the figure following at a distance, staying just beyond the range of vision but never losing sight of them. The elderly man from the flea market moved through the trees like a ghost, his pendant glowing softly in the shadows. The trap was working perfectly. The sensation of being watched had followed them all the way home. During the 2-hour drive back from the forest, Mike had checked his mirrors obsessively, convinced he glimpsed the same dark sedan in the distance, no matter which route he took. Sarah had dismissed it as paranoia until they pulled into their apartment complex and saw the elderly man from the flea market standing by the mailboxes, pretending to sort through letters while his eyes tracked their every movement. "That's him," Sarah whispered as they sat in their car, engine still running. "The seller? What's he doing here?" Mike's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "How does he know where we live?" We paid in cash, didn't give him any information. They waited, hoping the man would leave, but he seemed content to maintain his vigil. Finally, Mike made the decision to park in the visitor section and approach their building from the back entrance. They climbed the rear stairwell to their third-floor apartment, hearts pounding with each step. Their front door stood slightly ajar. "I locked it," Mike said, his voice barely audible. "I know I locked it." Sarah pulled out her phone, ready to call 911, but Mike was already pushing the door open. The apartment looked exactly as they'd left it, except for one crucial detail. Everything had been moved slightly. Books were in the wrong order on shelves. Couch cushions were arranged differently. Kitchen items had been shifted inches from their usual positions. "Someone's been through everything," Sarah said, walking from room to room. But they put it all back, almost perfectly. They were looking for something specific, Mike realized. The backpacks. They rushed to the bedroom where they'd hidden the bags in the back of their closet. The backpacks were still there, but they'd clearly been examined. The bone whistle, which Sarah had carefully wrapped and placed inside one of the bags, now sat unwrapped on their bed, alongside something that definitely hadn't been there before. The obsidian blade was roughly 8 inches long, its surface polished to a mirror finish that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect. The handle was wrapped in what appeared to be ancient cloth, dark with age and stained with substances Sarah didn't want to identify. Despite its obvious antiquity, the edge looked razor-sharp. "This wasn't in the backpacks before," Mike said, though he made no move to touch the weapon. "Someone brought this here." Sarah approached the blade cautiously, her anthropological training overriding her fear. She'd seen similar artifacts in museum collections, ceremonial knives used in various religious traditions, but this one radiated menace in a way that made her skin crawl. "It's obsidian," she said, studying the craftsmanship. "Volcanic glass. This kind of napping technique is incredibly sophisticated. Pre-Columbian maybe, or European Bronze Age. Sarah, how old does it have to be before we call it evidence of murder?" The blade rested on a piece of parchment covered in symbols, similar to those they'd seen in the backpacks and at the forest site. But these symbols were different, more complex, arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. Sarah's laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender's address was a string of numbers and letters that meant nothing to her. But the subject line made her blood freeze. "You have something that belongs to us." She opened the email with trembling fingers. The message was brief. "The artifacts choose their own guardians. You were selected not by chance, but by design. The previous guardian grows old and weak. His time of service ends. Yours begins. Do not attempt to involve authorities. Do not attempt to flee. The bonds are stronger than distance, deeper than death. You will understand soon." Attached to the email was a single photograph. Sarah and Mike in the forest clearing, taken from a distance, but clear enough to show them excavating the ritual site. In the background, barely visible among the trees, stood a figure watching them. "How did they get our email?" Mike demanded, reading over her shoulder.
"How did they get that photo?"
Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. This time she recognized the number, their landlord. "Sarah? Thank God you answered. Listen, I need you and Mike to be very careful. There was a man here asking about you two, wanted to know about your lease, when you'd be home, whether you lived alone. I didn't give him any information, but something about him made my skin crawl. You haven't gotten mixed up in anything dangerous, have you?" Sarah exchanged glances with Mike. "What did he look like?" "Elderly, maybe 70s. Thin, pale eyes. He had this pendant around his neck, some kind of weird symbol. When I told him I couldn't give out tenant information, he just smiled and said it didn't matter, that he already knew everything he needed to know." The call ended, leaving Sarah and Mike staring at each other across their violated apartment. The obsidian blade seemed to pulse with malevolent energy on their bed, and the bone whistle sat beside it like its pale companion in some ancient ritual they were only beginning to understand. Outside, evening was falling, and with it came the growing certainty that their normal life had ended the moment they'd opened those backpacks. They were no longer investigating a mystery. They had become part of it. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the second backpack more thoroughly, feeling along every seam and pocket with desperate precision. If someone had planted the obsidian blade without them noticing, what else might they have missed? Her fingers found a section of the inner lining that felt different, slightly thicker than the rest. "There's something sewn into the fabric," she said, using a small knife to carefully open the seam. What emerged was a digital camera, compact and outdated, but still functional. The LCD screen flickered to life when she pressed the power button. Mike leaned closer as Sarah navigated through the camera's menu. The memory card contained 47 photos, and the first few images made them both recoil in horror. Recent photos, judging by the digital quality, showing bound and terrified victims in what appeared to be the same forest clearing they'd visited that morning. "These people are still alive in these photos," Mike said, his voice barely steady. "Look at the timestamps. Some of these are from last month." Sarah scrolled through the images with growing dread. The victims were all young adults, hikers by their clothing and gear, photographed in various stages of what could only be described as ritual preparation. Their heads had been shaved, strange symbols painted on their skin with what appeared to be mud or ash. The terror in their eyes was unmistakable. "This isn't historical," Sarah whispered. "This is happening now." The later photos showed the clearing transformed for ceremony. Candles arranged in complex patterns. The blackened stone circle they'd discovered expanded into an elaborate altar. And in the final images, figures in hooded robes moved through the scene like shadows given substance. Mike pointed to one of the robed figures. "Look at this one. See how he's holding something?" Sarah zoomed in on the image. The figure's face was hidden by a deep hood, but his hands were clearly visible, and in them he held what appeared to be the same bone whistle they'd excavated. The implications hit her like a physical blow. "They knew we'd find it," she said. "The whistle, the blade, everything. It's all connected. Someone wanted us to discover these things, but why?" Mike demanded. "What do they want from us?" Sarah continued scrolling through the photos, looking for answers. Near the end of the memory card, she found images that weren't from the forest at all. These showed an ordinary suburban house, photographed from various angles as if someone were conducting surveillance. It took her a moment to realize she was looking at her childhood home, the house where her parents still lived 2 states away. "No," she breathed, zooming in on a photo of her mother tending the garden. "They've been watching my family." Mike's face went pale as the full scope of their situation became clear. "Sarah, we need to call the police. Right now. These people are planning something, and we're in way over our heads." But even as he reached for his phone, Sarah was shaking her head. "Look at this," she said, showing him another photo. It showed 2 police officers in uniform, standing at the edge of the forest clearing. They weren't investigating the scene or treating it as a crime site. They were participating in it, their badges clearly visible as they helped arrange ritual implements around the blackened stones. "They're part of it," Sarah said, the words barely audible. "The police are part of whatever this is." Mike stared at the image in disbelief. One of the officers was someone he recognized, Detective Morrison, who'd spoken at a neighborhood watch meeting just 6 months ago. A man they'd trusted, who'd seemed genuinely committed to community safety. "How deep does this go?" Mike asked, but Sarah was already finding more answers in the photos. Images of city officials, local business leaders, even their mail carrier, all participating in what appeared to be the same ritual gatherings. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The final photo on the camera showed something that made Sarah's breath catch. It was a group shot of the robed figures, hoods pulled back to reveal their faces. At the center stood the elderly man who'd sold them the backpacks, but he looked different. Younger somehow, his pale eyes bright with an energy that seemed to radiate power. Around him stood dozens of others, and Sarah recognized far too many faces, her college advisor. The librarian who'd helped them research the missing persons cases, their landlord. Even the cashier from their local grocery store were completely surrounded. Mike said, studying the faces. Everyone we might turn to for help is part of this. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Check your parents. Check them now. With trembling fingers, she dialed her childhood home. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Her father's cheerful recorded greeting sounded obscenely normal given their circumstances. She tried her mother's cell phone. Same result. They're not answering, Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. My parents always answer their phones. Mike was already grabbing his keys. We drive there. Right now. It's a 6-hour drive, and it'll be dark soon. Then we drive through the night, Mike said. Sarah, look at these photos. Look at what these people are capable of. We can't wait until morning. As they gathered their essential belongings, preparing to flee their apartment, neither of them noticed the small red light blinking in the corner of their bedroom. The camera they'd found wasn't just a repository of evidence. It was still recording. The elderly man's house sat on the outskirts of town, a weathered Victorian that had seen better decades. Sarah and Mike had made the impulsive decision to confront him directly rather than flee immediately to her parents. They needed answers, and he was the only link they had to the truth behind the artifacts. This is insane, Mike muttered as they walked up the overgrown path to the front door. We should be running, not walking into whatever trap this is. He's old, Sarah replied, though her voice lacked conviction. And we need to understand what we're dealing with before we involve my family. The door opened before they could knock. The man stood there as if he'd been expecting them, dressed in a faded cardigan and wool pants that made him look like anyone's grandfather. Only his pale eyes betrayed the danger Sarah had sensed at the flea market. You came, he said simply. Good. There isn't much time. He led them into a living room that smelled of old books and medicinal herbs. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades, and Sarah noticed with growing unease that many showed the same forest clearing they'd visited, photographed across different seasons and years. But it was the coffee table that drew their attention. Spread across its surface were dozens of handwritten letters, all bearing the same letterhead. St. Mary's Hospital. Sit, the man said, gesturing to an ancient couch. My name is Harold Whitmore, and I've been carrying this burden for 43 years. I'm dying, you see. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months at most, according to the doctors. Sarah remained standing. You sold us those backpacks knowing what was in them. You've been watching us, following us. Why? Harold smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Because the artifacts choose their own guardians. I've been trying to pass them on for years, but they always find their way back to me. Until now, he picked up one of the letters from the hospital, holding it so they could see the official medical seal. I was diagnosed 4 months ago. That night I had the first dream. The artifacts showed me your faces, told me where to find you, how to make the transfer. Transfer? Mike stepped closer to Sarah, his protective instincts flaring. What are you talking about? Harold opened a desk drawer and withdrew a handwritten document. Pages and pages of cramped text in fading ink. My confession, he said. Everything I've done, everyone who died because of me. 43 years of service to something ancient and hungry. Sarah took the document, scanning the first page. The writing was meticulous, almost obsessive in its detail. Names, dates, locations, methods. A catalogue of horror, written in the careful hand of a man trying to unburden his soul. I was 28 when they recruited me, Harold continued. Lost, angry, looking for purpose. They promised meaning, power, connection to something greater than myself. For decades, I believed I was serving a higher purpose. You were murdering people, Mike said, his voice tight with controlled rage. I was feeding something that demands to be fed, Harold corrected. Something that has existed far longer than human civilization. Something that shaped the very foundations of our reality. The artifacts aren't tools, they're anchors. They bind this entity to our world, allow it to influence events, to ensure its continued survival. Sarah read further into the confession, her academic mind trying to process the implications. The document detailed not just murders, but a sophisticated network of recruitment and indoctrination. Politicians, law enforcement, business leaders. all drawn into service through a combination of blackmail, bribery, and genuine conversion to what Harold called the greater truth. But something changed, Harold said, watching her read. 5 years ago, I began to see clearly what I'd become. The cancer, perhaps, or simply age bringing wisdom. I realized I'd spent my life feeding a parasite, not serving a god. So you decided to pass the responsibility to us, Sarah said, anger building in her voice. Make us your replacements. Harold shook his head. I tried to destroy the artifacts, burn them, threw them into rivers, buried them in concrete. They always returned. The entity won't allow its anchors to be destroyed, not while it still has servants in this world. He stood and walked to a window overlooking his overgrown garden. But you're different. The artifacts recognize something in you that they've never encountered in me or any of my predecessors. You have the potential to break the cycle. What are you talking about? Mike demanded. Harold turned back to them, and for the first time Sarah saw genuine hope in his pale eyes. Your ancestor, he said, looking directly at Sarah. Margaret Whitman, your great-great-grandmother. She was the last person to successfully resist the entity, to actually damage its hold on this world. The artifacts remember her bloodline. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Her great-great-grandmother had been a family legend, a woman who'd supposedly fought against some unnamed evil in the 1800s before disappearing entirely from historical records. That's impossible, she whispered. Harold smiled. And this time there was warmth in it. The entity thinks so too. It believes it can corrupt you as it corrupted me, turn your resistance into service. But Margaret's blood runs strong in you. You have abilities you haven't discovered yet, power that can actually threaten what we've been serving. A sound from upstairs made them all freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving across the floorboards above their heads. They've found us, Harold said, his moment of hope evaporating into fear. I hoped we'd have more time. The footsteps on the stairs were unmistakable now, multiple sets, moving with coordinated precision. Harold pressed his confession into Sarah's hands. Take this, learn from my mistakes, and whatever you do, don't let them separate you from the artifacts. They're your only protection now. The living room door exploded inward, and figures in dark clothing poured through the opening. Sarah caught a glimpse of familiar faces. Detective Morrison, their librarian, others she recognized from the camera's photos. Harold smiled one final time. Run, he said. Then the first gunshot echoed through the house, and everything changed forever. The Millbrook Public Library had always been Sarah's sanctuary, a place where she'd spent countless hours researching papers during graduate school. Now, hiding in the basement archives at 3 in the morning, it felt like a tomb. She and Mike had escaped Harold's house through a back window, but the old man's gunshot had echoed in their ears during the desperate flight through darkened streets. Harold was dead. Sarah was certain of it, though she tried not to think about what his final moments must have been like. His confession, blood-stained and crumpled from their hasty escape, lay spread across the archive table alongside decades of local newspaper files she'd been systematically searching. Listen to this, she whispered to Mike, who was keeping watch by the basement windows. Millbrook Gazette, October 15th, 1923. Local woman leads crusade against devil worship. It's about Margaret Whitman, my great-great-grandmother. Mike abandoned his post to read over her shoulder. The article was brief but revealing, describing Margaret as a moral reformer who had exposed what she claimed was a satanic cult operating in the area's forests. According to the report, she had provided local authorities with evidence of ritual murders spanning several years. She actually fought them, Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. Harold wasn't lying, but it was the next article, dated just 2 weeks later, that made her blood run cold. Local reformer dies in suspicious fire. Margaret Whitman's house had burned to the ground with her inside it, though neighbors reported seeing her trying to save something from the flames before the roof collapsed. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out the photocopied death certificate she'd found in the genealogy files. Cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation, but handwritten notes in the margin told a different story. The coroner had noted unusual burns on Margaret's hands and arms, patterns that suggested she'd been clutching something metallic that had grown superheated in the fire. She died protecting something, Sarah realized. Something important enough to die for. Mike had found a different file, this one from the 1970s. Look at this. Harold's name appears in police reports from 1978. He was questioned about 3 missing hikers, but the investigation was dropped due to lack of evidence. The investigating officer was someone named Captain Morrison. Morrison? Sarah's heart sank. That has to be Detective Morrison's father or grandfather. This goes back generations, Mike. The same families, the same positions of power, all serving this thing. She continued searching through the archives, looking for any mention of Margaret Whitman's final battle. In a box of miscellaneous historical documents, she found what she was looking for, a hand-drawn map, remarkably similar to the one they'd found in the backpack, but older and annotated with different symbols. Margaret made this, Sarah breathed, studying the careful cartography. She mapped their ritual sites just like Harold did. But look at the differences. Where Harold's map showed active ritual locations, Margaret's showed something else entirely. Sites that had been cleansed, according to her annotations. Places where she'd somehow disrupted whatever dark energy the cult was trying to harvest. At the center of Margaret's map was a symbol Sarah hadn't seen before. A circle surrounded by protective wards, with detailed instructions written in faded ink. The location was marked as Final Sanctuary, and the coordinates placed it somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, roughly 100 miles from their current location. She built something, Sarah said. Excitement building despite their desperate circumstances. Some kind of stronghold or protected space. Harold said I had abilities I hadn't discovered yet. Maybe Margaret left instructions, tools, something that could help us fight back. Mike wasn't convinced. Sarah, we don't even know if that place still exists. It's been over a century. And we've got a murderous cult hunting us with the local police on their side. Before Sarah could respond, they heard footsteps on the floor above. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was methodically searching the building. Mike moved to the basement entrance and listened. Multiple sets of feet, coordinated movement, professional search patterns. They found us. He whispered. Sarah gathered Margaret's map and the most crucial documents, stuffing them into her jacket. As they prepared to escape through the basement's rear entrance, she noticed something she'd missed before. Tucked between the pages of Margaret's map was a small pendant, tarnished with age, but unmistakably crafted from the same dark stone as the artifacts they'd found. The bloodstone pendant felt warm in her palm, and the moment her skin made contact, images flooded her mind. Margaret standing in a circle of protective stones, chanting words in a language Sarah somehow understood. The same forest clearing they'd discovered, but transformed into something else entirely. A place of power turned against its original purpose. Sarah? Mike's voice seemed to come from very far away. We have to go now. The images faded, leaving Sarah with knowledge she hadn't possessed moments before. She understood with crystal clarity what Margaret had tried to do and why she'd ultimately failed. The pendant wasn't just jewelry. It was a key, a focus for abilities that had been dormant in her bloodline for over a century. I know where we need to go, she said, pocketing the pendant. And I think I know how to stop them. The footsteps above were getting closer, accompanied by voices she recognized. Detective Morrison was directing the search, his commands echoing through the library's halls like a military operation. Sarah and Mike slipped out through the basement's emergency exit into the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, the library blazed with flashlight beams as their pursuers discovered the abandoned archive table. They had maybe a 10-minute head start, and 100 miles to travel before the cult could complete whatever ritual they'd been building toward for decades. But for the first time since finding the backpacks, Sarah felt something other than fear. She felt ready to fight back. Their car had been sabotaged. Sarah and Mike discovered this at 4 in the morning when the engine died completely on a remote mountain road, still 30 miles from Margaret's marked sanctuary. Steam poured from under the hood, and Mike's cursory inspection revealed severed brake lines and a punctured radiator. "They knew we'd run," Mike said, staring at the deliberate damage. "They're herding us like animals." Sarah pulled out Margaret's map, trying to orient themselves by the pale moonlight. The road they were on didn't appear on any modern GPS system, but it matched one of the paths marked on her great-great-grandmother's century-old cartography. They were in the right area, but still miles from their destination on foot through dangerous terrain. "We walk," she said, shouldering the backpack that contained their artifacts and documents. "There's no choice." They had been hiking through dense forest for less than an hour when they found the first warning. Nailed to a tree at eye level was a strip of leather, roughly 4 inches long and 2 inches wide. The surface was covered with branded symbols that seemed to writhe in their flashlight beam, and the texture was unmistakably organic. "That's human skin," Mike said, his voice tight with revulsion. "Someone branded human skin and left it as a message." Sarah forced herself to examine the gruesome artifact more closely. The branding was precise, professional, creating symbols that matched those they'd seen throughout their ordeal. But this wasn't ancient work. The edges of the brands were still sharp, the flesh relatively fresh. "It's a warning," she realized. "They're telling us to turn back." "From who?" Mike demanded. "The cult?" But Sarah was studying Margaret's map more carefully, comparing it to their current location. According to the old woman's notations, they were entering what she called a contested zone, an area where the cult's influence was strong but not absolute. "No," Sarah said slowly. "I think this is from someone else. Someone who doesn't want us getting closer to the sanctuary." They found more branded skin strips as they climbed higher into the mountains, each one displaying increasingly aggressive symbols. The messages were clear even without translation: "Stop, danger, death awaits." But they were also accompanied by something else, scratched into tree bark in what appeared to be the same hand that had created Margaret's map. "The path remains," Sarah read from one carving. "Blood calls to blood. Do not falter, your ancestor?" Mike asked. "Impossible. She died over a century ago." But even as Sarah said it, she felt the bloodstone pendant growing warm against her chest. The artifact was responding to something in the environment, some energy or presence that connected her to this place. They crested a ridge just as dawn was breaking and saw their destination spread below them, a valley that didn't appear on any modern map, hidden by the careful arrangement of hills and forest that would make it invisible from aerial photography. At the valley's center stood the ruins of what had once been a substantial compound. Stone buildings arranged in a defensive pattern around a central courtyard. "Margaret's sanctuary," Sarah breathed. But they weren't alone in the valley. Smoke rose from several locations among the ruins, and Sarah could make out figures moving between the buildings. Her heart sank as she realized their refuge had been compromised. "They got here first," Mike said, adjusting their binoculars for a better view. "I count at least a dozen people down there, maybe more." Through the lenses, Sarah could see the cult members had established a camp among Margaret's ruins. They'd set up modern equipment alongside what appeared to be ritual implements, creating a bizarre fusion of ancient ceremony and contemporary technology. At the compound's heart, they were constructing something that made her blood freeze. "They're building an altar," she said. "A massive one, right where Margaret's protective circle used to be." Mike took the binoculars and studied the scene below. "Those aren't just cult members," he said. "I can see uniforms. Police, maybe military. And there are vehicles I don't recognize. Official-looking stuff with government plates." Sarah felt the pendant pulse against her skin, its warmth spreading through her chest like a slow burn. With the sensation came understanding, knowledge that seemed to flow directly into her consciousness from some external source. "It's not just a local cult," she realized. "It's something much bigger. National, maybe international. And they've been waiting for this moment for over a century. What moment? The return of Margaret's bloodline. They need me here, Mike. Not to recruit me, not to convert me, but for something else entirely. The pendant's warmth was becoming uncomfortable, almost painful. They need my blood for their ritual. A new sound echoed across the valley. Helicopters approaching from the south. Sarah watched through the binoculars as military aircraft settled into makeshift landing zones around the compound, disgorging personnel in tactical gear. "We're not dealing with a small-town conspiracy," Mike said, his face pale with realization. "This is government-level stuff. Black Ops, classified operations." Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on something else. Among the ruins, she could see a figure that didn't belong with the others. An elderly woman, moving independently of the cult members, occasionally pausing to examine sections of broken wall or collapsed structures. "There's someone else down there," she said. "Someone who's not with them." Through the binoculars, the woman looked up toward their ridge, as if she could sense their observation. Even at this distance, Sarah could see the resemblance. The same bone structure, the same determined posture she'd seen in old family photographs. The woman, who couldn't possibly be alive, raised one hand in greeting, then pointed toward a section of the compound that appeared less heavily guarded. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. But the pendant was burning against her skin now, confirming what her rational mind refused to accept. Margaret Whitman was waiting for her in the valley below. The tracking began just after sunset. Sarah and Mike had spent the day hidden in the forest above the valley, watching the cult's preparations and trying to find a way to reach the mysterious woman who resembled Margaret. But as darkness fell, they realized their observers had become their hunters. "They know exactly where we are," Mike whispered, pointing to the coordinated movement of lights in the forest below. "Look how they're moving, not searching randomly, but heading directly for us." Sarah clutched the bloodstone pendant, which had been growing steadily warmer throughout the day. "It's the artifacts," she realized with growing horror. "They're not just connected to the cult's rituals. They're tracking devices." She pulled the bone whistle from her pack, studying it in the dying light. What she'd initially taken for decorative, carvings now revealed themselves as something far more sophisticated. A network of tiny holes and channels that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "These aren't just ritual objects," she said. "They're alive somehow, connected to whatever entity the cult serves." Mike examined the obsidian blade, noting how its surface seemed to ripple like liquid in the moonlight. Harold said the artifacts choose their own guardians. Maybe he meant that literally. The hunters were getting closer, their lights creating a tightening circle around the ridge where Sarah and Mike had taken shelter. But there was something wrong with the pursuit pattern. The cult members moved with purpose, but also with obvious reluctance, as if approaching something they feared as much as Sarah did. "They're scared," Sarah observed. "Look at how they're hanging back, staying in groups. They don't want to get too close to us, or to the artifacts we're carrying." Sarah felt a sudden clarity, understanding flooding through her mind like cold water. The pendant isn't just tracking us for them, it's protecting us from them. That's why they can't approach directly. She held up the bloodstone pendant, studying the symbols carved into its dark surface. In the moonlight, the markings seemed to glow within a fire, and she could feel power radiating from the stone like heat from a forge. "Margaret didn't just fight the cult," Sarah said. "She turned their own weapons against them. These artifacts, they're not just tools of control. In the right hands, they're instruments of liberation." A new sound cut through the night, the rhythmic beating of drums echoing from the valley below. The ritual was beginning, and with it came an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on the mountain like a physical force. Trees swayed without wind, and the very air grew thick and difficult to breathe. Mike grabbed Sarah's arm. "Something's happening to you." She looked down at her hands and gasped. Her skin was beginning to glow with the same inner light as the pendant, and she could feel power coursing through her veins like electricity. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I can see them," she whispered. "All of them. Their thoughts, their fears, their connections to each other and to the thing they serve." The tracking stones the cult members carried became visible to her enhanced perception, small crystalline objects that pulsed with malevolent energy. But she could also see the weakness in their network, the gaps and vulnerabilities that Margaret had discovered over a century ago. "The stones work both ways," Sarah said, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "They connect the cult members to their entity, but they also make them vulnerable to someone who understands the connection." She reached out with her newfound awareness, touching the consciousness of the nearest hunter. The man's mind was a maze of conditioning and supernatural influence, but underneath the layers of control was something human and terrified. With careful precision, Sarah began to unravel the connections that bound him to the cult's collective will. It was like performing surgery on a living network, cutting specific threads while leaving others intact. The man stopped moving, confusion replacing purpose in his thoughts. "I can free them," Sarah said, wonder in her voice. "Not all of them, not the ones who chose this willingly, but the ones who were coerced or corrupted. I can break the bonds that hold them." Mike watched in amazement as, one by one, the hunting lights began to go out. Not extinguished, but abandoned as their bearers stumbled away in confusion, suddenly remembering who they had been before the cult's influence took hold. "How many can you reach?" he asked. Sarah extended her awareness further, touching mind after mind in the network of hunters. Some resisted her influence, their corruption too deep or their allegiance too willing, but others welcomed her intervention like drowning swimmers grasping for rescue. "Maybe half," she said. "The others are too far gone or too committed to what they're doing." The drums from the valley grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah felt an answering pull in her blood. The ritual below was calling to her, demanding her presence whether she chose to give it or not. "They're starting the main ceremony," she said. "And I think I understand now why they need me alive. The entity they serve, it's not just parasitic, it's incomplete. It needs a willing host with the right bloodline to fully manifest in our world. And if it succeeds..." Sarah looked down at the valley where ancient evil was stirring to life, where her ancestors' greatest enemy was preparing to break free from centuries of limitation. Then everything Margaret died to prevent comes to pass. The entity gains a permanent foothold in our reality, and the cult becomes something far more dangerous than a collection of murderers and fanatics. The tracking stones in the forest began to pulse in unison, creating a rhythm that matched the drums below. The final phase of the hunt was beginning. The abandoned church had seemed like salvation in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah and Mike, exhausted from their flight through the mountains, had spotted its bell tower through the trees and approached with desperate hope. Ancient stone walls, Gothic windows, the peaceful aura of consecrated ground, everything suggested sanctuary from the horrors pursuing them. The priest who answered their frantic knocking appeared to be everything they needed. Elderly, kind-faced, speaking in gentle tones about providing refuge for travelers in distress. Father Benedict, he called himself, and he welcomed them into the church's candlelit interior with open arms and promises of safety. "You're safe here," he had assured them, his voice carrying the comforting authority of decades in service. "This is holy ground. No evil can touch you within these walls." Sarah had wanted to believe him. The church's interior radiated peace, its wooden pews worn smooth by countless worshippers, its stained glass windows casting rainbow patterns in the early morning light. But something felt wrong. The candles burned with unusual flames, too bright and too still, as if the air itself had been drained of natural movement. "I'll prepare some food and proper beds," Father Benedict said, disappearing into what appeared to be the sacristy. "You both look as if you've traveled far." Mike settled into a front pew, finally allowing exhaustion to claim him. But Sarah remained alert, her enhanced awareness picking up subtle wrongness in their surroundings. The church felt empty in a way that went beyond the absence of congregation. It felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been removed from its spiritual foundation. When Father Benedict returned, Sarah noticed details that her heightened perception made impossible to ignore. His cassock was traditional black, but the fabric seemed to absorb light rather than merely appearing dark. His clerical collar caught the candlelight strangely, revealing symbols etched into what should have been plain white linen. "Tell me about your troubles," the priest said, settling across from them with the patience of a confessor. "What brings you to seek sanctuary at such an hour?" Sarah exchanged glances with Mike, unsure how much to reveal. But her growing supernatural sensitivity was screaming warnings now, and she found herself studying Father Benedict's face more carefully. His features were kind, grandfatherly, but his eyes held depths that seemed wrong for any human being. "We're being followed," Mike said carefully, "by some very dangerous people." "Ah," Father Benedict nodded knowingly. "The modern world creates many kinds of persecution, but you're safe now. This church has provided sanctuary for travelers for over 2 centuries. 2 centuries. Sarah's blood went cold as she realized the implications. This church had been here during Margaret's time, during the original conflict with the cult. She pulled out Margaret's map, studying the area around their current location. The church was marked on her great-great-grandmother's cartography, but not as a place of safety. Margaret had marked it with the symbol for corrupted ground, a sacred space that had been turned to dark purposes. "Father," Sarah said carefully, "how long have you served this parish?" His smile never wavered. "Oh, I've been here longer than most people remember. This community has always needed spiritual guidance, especially given its unique challenges." As he spoke, Sarah noticed movement in the shadows near the altar. Figures in dark robes were emerging from concealed passages, moving with the silent coordination of a practiced ritual. At their head walked someone she recognized from the photographs, Detective Morrison, but wearing robes instead of a police uniform. "You were right to come here," Father Benedict continued, and now Sarah could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "This is exactly where you belong." He reached into his cassock and withdrew something that made Sarah's breath catch. A ceremonial mask, carved from what appeared to be human bone, and decorated with the same symbols they'd encountered throughout their ordeal. As he placed it over his face, his entire presence changed, becoming something ancient and hungry. "The shepherd has been waiting for his lost lamb to return," the masked figure said, its voice carrying echoes that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the church. "Margaret's blood calls to us across the centuries, as we knew it would." Mike was on his feet instantly, but cult members had already surrounded their pew. There was no escape through the main doors, and the windows were too high and narrow to offer any exit. "The artifacts, please," Detective Morrison said, extending his hand. "You've carried them far enough. Time to let them fulfill their true purpose." Sarah clutched the bloodstone pendant, feeling its power surge in response to the direct threat. "What true purpose?" "To anchor our Lord's full manifestation in this world," the masked priest replied. "Your blood, willingly given, will complete a working that began over 200 years ago. The entity will finally have a permanent vessel, and through it dominion over all human consciousness. And if I refuse?" The priest's laugh echoed strangely in the church's vaulted space. "Look around you, child. This sanctuary has hosted dozens of reluctant participants over the decades. The basement is quite well equipped for persuasion." Sarah felt the pendant growing hot against her skin, its power building to dangerous levels. Through her enhanced perception, she could see the network of dark energy that flowed through the church like spiritual poison, connecting each cult member to their collective purpose. But she could also see something else, hairline cracks in that network, places where Margaret's ancient work had never been completely undone. Her ancestor had been here, had fought in this very space, and had left behind weapons that only her bloodline could activate. "Mike," she said quietly, "when I tell you, run for the basement stairs." "Sarah, I'm not leaving you. Trust me." She gripped the pendant tightly. feeling its power merge with abilities she was only beginning to understand. The masked priest stepped closer, confident in his victory, unaware that Margaret Whitman's greatest weapon was about to be unleashed in his corrupted sanctuary. The FBI agent appeared at the church's entrance like an answer to prayer, his badge catching the candlelight as he surveyed the scene with professional calm. Agent David Chen moved with the quiet authority of federal law enforcement, his presence immediately commanding attention from both Sarah and the robed figures surrounding her. Special Agent Chen, FBI, he announced, his voice carrying across the sanctuary. I'm going to need everyone to step back from the civilians. Detective Morrison looked uncertain for the first time since Sarah had met him. Agent Chen, you're outside your jurisdiction here. This is a local matter. Ritual murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy across state lines make it very much a federal matter, Chen replied, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. I've been tracking this organization for 3 years. Sarah felt a surge of hope as the agent approached, but her enhanced awareness picked up something that made her hesitate. The agent's thoughts were shielded in a way that seemed unnatural, and there was something familiar about his mental signature that she couldn't place. Agent Chen, she said carefully, how did you know to find us here? He smiled, and in that expression, Sarah glimpsed something that made her blood freeze. It was the same cold satisfaction she'd seen in Father Benedict's eyes moments before. Because I've been guiding you here from the beginning, Chen said, his professional facade dropping away. Every step of your journey, every decision you made, was carefully orchestrated to bring you to this moment. He reached into his jacket, and instead of producing a weapon, he withdrew something far more ominous, a signet ring carved from the same dark stone as the bloodstone pendant. As he slipped it onto his finger, the temperature in the church dropped noticeably, and Sarah could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The Master's Ring, Father Benedict said with reverence. I didn't know you carried such authority. There are many things you don't know, priest, Chen replied. This operation extends far beyond your little rural cult. We have cells in every major city, agents in every branch of government, influence that reaches into the highest levels of power. Sarah stared at the ring, her supernatural sight revealing the truth behind its dark radiance. Trapped within the stone were dozens of souls, their spiritual energy bound to serve whoever wore the ring. She could see their faces pressed against the interior surface, like prisoners against glass, their silent screams echoing in dimensions beyond normal perception. You're not FBI, Mike said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Oh, but I am, Chen assured him. 20-year veteran, impeccable service record, currently assigned to the Bureau's Unusual Phenomena Division. Of course, that division serves a purpose far different from what my colleagues believe. He gestured to the cult members, who moved aside with obvious deference. We've been cultivating Sarah's bloodline for generations, waiting for the right combination of genetic markers and spiritual sensitivity. Her great-great-grandmother nearly ruined everything with her interference, but we've learned from that mistake. Margaret actually hurt you, Sarah realized. That's why you needed so long to recover, to rebuild. Chen nodded approvingly. Very good. Yes, Margaret Whitman managed to sever several crucial connections, banish our Lord back to the spaces between worlds. It took us over a century to repair the damage and prepare for another attempt at full manifestation. The ring on his finger pulsed with malevolent energy, and Sarah could feel its influence pressing against her mind like a physical weight. But the bloodstone pendant responded with equal force, creating a barrier that kept Chen's power at bay. However, Chen continued, we've learned to be more patient, more thorough. Instead of trying to force the bloodline into service, we've spent generations subtly guiding it, creating the conditions for willing cooperation. I'll never cooperate with you, Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she felt doubt creeping into her mind. Had her entire life been manipulated? Were her feelings for Mike genuine, or part of some elaborate psychological conditioning? Chen smiled as if reading her thoughts. You already have, my dear. Every choice you've made since finding those backpacks has brought you closer to your destined role. Even your resistance serves our purpose, strengthening your connection to the artifacts and preparing you for the transformation to come." He raised his hand, and Sarah saw that the Master's ring was connected to every other artifact in the room by threads of dark energy. The bone whistle, the obsidian blade, even her own bloodstone pendant were part of a vast network of spiritual machinery designed for a single purpose. "The entity needs a conscious host," Chen explained. "Not a mindless vessel, but an aware participant who can serve as its anchor in the physical world. Your bloodline provides the genetic compatibility. Your academic training provides the intellectual framework. And your recent experiences have awakened the necessary spiritual sensitivity. And if I refuse?" Chen gestured to the souls trapped within his ring. "Then you join them, and we wait for the next generation. Your cousin in Seattle has shown promising potential, as has her daughter. The bloodline will eventually produce what we need." Sarah felt the full weight of her situation settling over her like a shroud. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her entire family line was at risk, and her resistance might only delay the inevitable while placing others in danger. But as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she noticed something Chen seemed to have overlooked. The network of energy connecting the artifacts wasn't entirely under his control. Margaret's influence remained, woven into the very fabric of the spiritual machinery. Waiting for the right moment to reassert itself, Sarah gripped the bloodstone pendant tighter, feeling her ancestors' presence stirring within the stone. The power erupted from Sarah like lightning made manifest. The bloodstone pendant blazed with brilliant light as centuries of dormant energy awakened in her bloodline, transforming her from victim to weapon in the span of a heartbeat. Agent Chen stumbled backward, his master's ring flickering as Sarah's newfound abilities disrupted the network of control he'd spent years perfecting. "Impossible," Chen breathed, raising his hand to shield his eyes from the radiance pouring from Sarah's transformed form. The conditioning should have prevented this level of manifestation. Sarah felt her consciousness expanding beyond the confines of her physical body, her awareness touching every artifact, every cult member, every thread of dark energy that bound them together. But most importantly, she could feel Margaret's presence fully awakening within the pendant. Her ancestors' knowledge and experience flowing into her mind like water into a dry riverbed. "You never understood what you were dealing with," Sarah said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Margaret didn't just resist your entity. She wounded it, marked it, made it vulnerable to her bloodline forever." The cult members were backing away now, their confidence shattered by the display of power they'd never anticipated. Even Father Benedict's masked presence seemed diminished, his ancient authority challenged by something older and more fundamental. But it was the artifacts that revealed the true scope of what was happening. The soul-binding rope that Chen had brought to secure Sarah was writhing like a living thing, the spirits trapped within its fibers suddenly able to sense freedom. The rope was made from the hair of victims, stretching back centuries, each strand imbued with the suffering and desperate hope of those who had died. Sarah reached out with her enhanced perception and began to unravel the bindings that held those souls in torment. It was delicate work, like performing surgery on the fabric of reality itself, but Margaret's knowledge guided her hands with practiced precision. "Stop!" Jin commanded, raising the Master's ring and unleashing a wave of psychic force that would have shattered an ordinary mind. But Sarah's abilities were growing stronger by the moment. Fed by the liberation of each soul, she freed from bondage. The first spirit to escape the rope was a young woman Sarah recognized from the photographs, Jennifer Walsh, who had disappeared in 1991. Her ethereal form materialized in the church, no longer bound by the cult's will, but burning with righteous fury. "Thank you," Jennifer whispered, her voice echoing with the gratitude of the freed. Then she turned toward Agent Chen, and Sarah realized that the liberated spirits weren't departing peacefully. They wanted justice. More souls emerged from the rope as Sarah continued her work, each one adding to a growing crowd of victims who had waited decades for this moment. The church filled with spectral forms, all of them focused on the man who had orchestrated their suffering. Chen was backing toward the altar now, his confidence replaced by genuine fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with panic. "Without the entity's guidance, without the structure we've built, humanity will destroy itself. We're the shepherds, the protectors. You're parasites," Sarah replied, and now she could see the truth of what the cult really was. The entity they served wasn't some cosmic force or ancient god. It was something far more mundane and infinitely more horrible. A collective consciousness formed from centuries of accumulated human suffering, fed by pain and despair until it had gained the ability to influence the physical world. Margaret understood. Sarah continued, feeling her ancestors' memories merge with her own consciousness. "You're not serving something divine. You're feeding something that should never have existed." The soul-binding rope crumbled to ash as the last spirit was freed, and Sarah felt a surge of power that nearly overwhelmed her enhanced senses. But she was ready for it now, channeling the energy through the bloodstone pendant into the network of artifacts that connected the cult members. One by one, she began to sever their connections to the entity's influence. Not all of them could be saved. Some had chosen their path willingly and were too corrupted to return, but others were victims of manipulation and circumstance. And Sarah could offer them redemption. Detective Morrison was one of the first to break free, confusion and horror replacing the cold certainty that had driven him for years. He stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, then at the bodies of victims he had helped create. "What have I done?" he whispered, falling to his knees. "What you were forced to do," Sarah said gently, her power now focused entirely on Agent Chen and the core of resistance he represented. "But that ends now." Chen raised the Master's Ring one final time, pouring every ounce of stolen power into a desperate attack. The souls trapped within the stone screamed as he burned their essence like fuel, creating a blast of psychic energy that shook the church's foundations. But Sarah was no longer fighting alone. Margaret's spirit stood beside her, supported by dozens of liberated victims, all of them united in a single purpose. The bloodstone pendant flared with the combined will of everyone who had ever resisted the cult's influence, and Chen's attack shattered harmlessly against their collective strength. The Master's Ring cracked, then shattered completely, releasing souls that had been bound for far longer than any of the others. The mountain compound buzzed with activity as helicopters continued to arrive, disgorging personnel and equipment in a carefully choreographed operation. Sarah and Mike watched from their hidden position in the forest, using Margaret's map to navigate the network of concealed paths that allowed them to observe without detection. "It's bigger than we thought," Mike said, counting the aircraft through their binoculars. "That's not just local law enforcement down there. I can see federal markings, military transport, even some vehicles I don't recognize." Sarah studied the compound through her enhanced perception, seeing layers of reality that normal vision couldn't reveal. The cult's influence extended far beyond what they'd imagined, reaching into levels of government and military power that made their situation seem hopeless. At the compound's center, cult members were arranging objects around a massive bronze bowl, roughly 4 feet in diameter and decorated with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. The bowl sat at the exact center of what had once been Margaret's protective circle, its presence corrupting the sacred geometry her ancestor had died to create. "The summoning bowl," Sarah whispered, recognizing the artifact from Margaret's memories. "They're preparing for the final ritual." Through her supernatural sight, she could see the bowl's true purpose. It was designed to focus and amplify the entity's influence, serving as a conduit between dimensions that would allow their enemy to manifest fully in the physical world. The other artifacts they'd encountered were merely components of this greater working, pieces of a puzzle that had taken the cult over a century to assemble. "Look at the prisoners," Mike said, his voice tight with horror. Sarah followed his gaze to a section of the compound where dozens of people were being held in what appeared to be converted military tents. Through the enhanced vision the bloodstone pendant provided, she could see that these weren't random kidnapping victims. Each prisoner possessed some trace of psychic sensitivity, their spiritual energy marked by the same genetic markers that made her own bloodline valuable to the cult. "They're gathering others like me," she realized. "Not just my family, but anyone with the right combination of abilities." As they watched, cult members began selecting prisoners and leading them toward the summoning bowl. The chosen victims moved with the sluggish compliance of those under heavy sedation, but their spiritual signatures blazed with terrified awareness. They understood what was happening to them even if they couldn't resist. "We have to stop this," Mike said. But his voice carried the despair of someone who recognized impossible odds. Sarah felt the same hopelessness threatening to overwhelm her. But Margaret's presence stirred within the pendant, offering guidance born from a lifetime of fighting similar despair. Her ancestor had faced this same moment of apparent defeat and found a way forward. "Not stop," Sarah said slowly, understanding flooding through her consciousness. "Redirect." She pulled Margaret's map from her pack, studying the defensive positions her ancestor had marked around the compound. The cult thought they were using Margaret's sanctuary for their own purposes, but they'd failed to recognize the trap she'd built into its very foundations. Margaret didn't just create a protective circle, Sarah explained, tracing the hidden geometry with her finger. She built a weapon. The entire compound is designed to channel and focus spiritual energy, but not for the purpose the cult thinks. Through her enhanced perception, Sarah could see the true structure Margaret had created, a massive spiritual lens that could amplify and redirect any energy channeled through it. The cult was about to pour enormous power into the summoning bowl, expecting it to open a gateway for their entity. Instead, it would activate Margaret's hidden working and turn their own energy against them. "But we need to be at the focal point when it happens," Sarah continued. "The system needs a conscious operator, someone with the bloodline connection to activate the redirection protocols." Mike stared at her. "You're talking about walking directly into the middle of their ritual." "Into the middle of their trap," Sarah corrected. Margaret designed this entire scenario. She knew the cult would eventually return here, would try to use her sanctuary for their own purposes. She's been waiting over a century for someone with her blood to finish what she started. As if summoned by their conversation, the elderly woman Sarah had glimpsed earlier emerged from the compound's shadows. Even at a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable, and Sarah felt the bloodstone pendant pulse with recognition. "That's impossible," Mike breathed. "She died in 1923. "Her body died," Sarah said, understanding dawning. But Margaret found a way to anchor part of her consciousness to this place, to wait for the moment when her sacrifice could finally bear fruit. The figure below raised her hand in greeting, then began moving toward a section of the compound that appeared less heavily guarded. She was showing them a way in, a path that would take them directly to the heart of the cult's operation and Margaret's hidden weapon. "She's been preparing for this moment for over a century," Sarah said, "and now she needs us to help her finish it." The summoning bowl began to glow within a fire as cult members activated the ritual's opening phases. Round the compound, other artifacts started resonating in harmony, creating a network of power that stretched across multiple dimensions. Time was running out, and Sarah could feel the entity stirring in whatever realm it currently occupied. Sensing the approaching moment of its liberation, Margaret's plan was about to be put to its ultimate test. The infiltration required every ounce of stealth and supernatural ability Sarah had developed. Following Margaret's ghostly guidance, she and Mike crept through the compound's outer defenses, using paths that seemed to exist in the spaces between reality, hidden corridors that Margaret had built into the very fabric of the location over a century ago. As they moved deeper into the cult's stronghold, Sarah felt her bloodstone pendant growing warm against her chest, its power resonating with something buried beneath the compound's foundations. Through her enhanced perception, she could see the true structure Margaret had created, a guardian talisman of enormous proportions, built not from stone and metal, but from crystallized will and protective intent. "She's been here all along," Sarah whispered as they paused in the shadow of a supply tent. "Margaret didn't just die protecting this place. She became part of it, wove herself into its spiritual architecture." Mike peered around the tent's edge, counting the guards between their position and the central ritual area. "How do we get past all of them?" Sarah closed her eyes, feeling for the threads of connection that linked the compound's defenders to their supernatural master. Most of the cult members were bound too tightly to the entity's will for her to break their conditioning, but she could sense others whose allegiance was based on fear rather than fanaticism. "There," she said, pointing to a guard whose spiritual signature flickered with doubt and terror. "He's not here by choice." Reaching out with her abilities, Sarah touched the man's consciousness gently, not trying to control him, but simply offering him a moment of clarity. The guard stopped his patrol, confusion replacing the mechanical certainty that had driven his movements. He looked around as if seeing his surroundings for the first time, then quietly walked away from his post. "One down," Mike murmured. "About 50 to go." But Sarah was already working on the next guard, and the next, carefully unraveling the threads of coercion that held reluctant participants in place. Not all of them could be reached. Some were too far gone, others too willing in their service. But she managed to create small gaps in the security perimeter. They were making their way toward the final checkpoint when Sarah felt a presence she recognized. Her great-great-grandmother stood at the entrance to the ritual area, no longer trying to hide her supernatural nature. Margaret's spirit blazed with power, accumulated over more than a century of patient preparation. "You came," Margaret said, her voice carrying across dimensions to reach Sarah's enhanced hearing. "I wasn't certain the bloodline would prove strong enough." "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the knowledge flowing through the pendant. "Complete the guardian talisman," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the ritual area where the cult was preparing their final working. "I built the foundation, but it needs a living focus, someone with our blood, to activate its protective properties." Through her supernatural sight, Sarah could see what Margaret meant. The entire compound was built around a massive spiritual construct, invisible to normal perception, but blazing with potential energy. The cult thought they were conducting their ritual in a place of power, unaware that they were actually standing inside the largest protective talisman ever created. "But activating it will require sacrifice," Margaret continued, her ghostly form flickering with sorrow. "The same sacrifice I was prepared to make over a century ago." Sarah felt cold understanding wash over her. "You're asking me to die." "I'm asking you to transform," Margaret corrected. "To become something more than human, as I did. The guardian talisman needs a conscious spirit to direct its power. Someone who can stand watch against this entity and others like it for as long as necessary." Mike grabbed Sarah's arm, his face pale with horror. "There has to be another way. You can't ask her to give up her life for this." "Life, no," Margaret said gently. "But mortality, yes. The choice is yours, child. You can flee now, live a normal human span, and hope someone else will be strong enough to face this evil when it inevitably returns. Or you can accept the responsibility that comes with our bloodline." Sarah looked toward the ritual area where cult members were positioning the final prisoners around the summoning bowl. She could see the terror in their faces, the desperate hope that someone would save them. Beyond them, she sensed the entity stirring in its dimensional prison, eager for release and the chance to feed on human suffering for centuries to come. "If I become the guardian," she asked, "what happens to the cult? to all the people they've corrupted and controlled. The talisman will break their connection to the entity, Margaret explained. Those who served willingly will face judgment from earthly authorities. Those who were coerced will be free to rebuild their lives. And the entity itself will be banished so thoroughly that it will never again threaten this reality. Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling around her like a shroud. Everything in her life had led to this moment, this choice between personal happiness and cosmic responsibility. She looked at Mike, seeing the love and anguish in his eyes, knowing what her decision would cost them both. The guardian talisman pulsed beneath the compound, waiting for her choice. The ritual reached its crescendo as Sarah burst into the central chamber, her arrival perfectly timed to disrupt the moment of maximum vulnerability. The cult leader, revealed now as a figure of immense supernatural power, wore a crown crafted from obsidian and bone, its surface alive with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight from the summoning bowl. "The bloodline arrives at last," the leader intoned, his voice echoing with harmonics that suggested inhuman vocal cords. "We have waited so long for this moment." Sarah could see the truth of what stood before her now. This wasn't merely a human corrupted by supernatural influence. This was something that had transcended mortality entirely, becoming a vessel for the entity's will. The crown fused with his skull, its dark radiance pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Around the summoning bowl, dozens of prisoners knelt in perfect circles, their spiritual energy being slowly drained to fuel the ritual. Sarah recognized some faces from the missing persons photos, people who had disappeared years ago but were somehow still alive, sustained by the cult's need for their psychic essence. "Let them go," Sarah demanded, stepping forward with the bloodstone pendant blazing against her chest. "Your quarrel is with me, not with innocent people." The leader laughed, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. "Innocent? Child, these are the chosen, selected across decades for their spiritual sensitivity. They are the fuel that will allow our Lord to manifest permanently in your reality." Mike had positioned himself near the prisoners, using the chaos of Sarah's entrance to begin cutting their bonds. But the cult members seemed strangely unconcerned by his rescue efforts, and Sarah soon understood why. The prisoners were connected to the ritual by more than physical restraints. Threads of dark energy bound their life force directly to the summoning bowl. "Even if you free their bodies," the leader continued, "their souls are already pledged to our cause. When the transformation begins, they will die regardless, their essence consumed to birth something magnificent." Sarah felt Margaret's presence surge within the pendant, her ancestors' knowledge revealing the true horror of what the cult had planned. This wasn't just a summoning ritual, it was a spiritual harvesting on a massive scale, designed to create a permanent gateway between dimensions. "You're not summoning your entity," Sarah realized. "You're preparing to become it." The leader's smile revealed teeth that had been replaced with sharpened obsidian. "Very good. Yes, the old method was too risky, too dependent on maintaining connection across dimensional barriers. Far better to bring our Lord directly into this reality, housed in a form that cannot be banished or destroyed." As he spoke, the crown began to glow brighter, and Sarah could see it was pulling energy not just from the prisoners, but from every cult member present. They were willingly sacrificing their own life force to fuel their leader's transformation into something beyond human comprehension. "The process has already begun," the leader continued, his form starting to shift and expand. Nothing can stop it now, but Sarah was studying the spiritual architecture around them with enhanced perception, seeing how Margaret's hidden protections were woven into the very foundations of the chamber. The cult thought they were conducting their ritual in a place of power, unaware that they were actually standing inside an elaborate trap. "Margaret," Sarah whispered, feeling her ancestors' consciousness stirring within the pendant. "Show me how to activate the failsafe." Knowledge flooded into Sarah's mind, revealing the true purpose of the guardian talisman buried beneath the compound. It wasn't just a protective ward, it was a spiritual circuit breaker, designed to overload and shatter any attempt to bridge the dimensional barrier at this location. The activation required a conscious sacrifice, someone willing to pour their life force into the talisman's core matrix. Margaret had been prepared to make that sacrifice over a century ago, but the cult's interference had prevented her from completing the working. "Now I understand," Sarah said, raising the bloodstone pendant above her head. "You brought me here because you need my blood to complete the ritual. But my blood carries more than just genetic markers. It carries Margaret's protection, her resistance to your influence. The leader's transformation was accelerating, his human form stretching and distorting as something vast and alien pressed against the boundaries of physical reality. The crown had become part of his skull now, its dark radiance spreading like infection through his nervous system. "Your protection is meaningless," he snarled, his voice deepening into inhuman registers. "We have planned for every contingency, accounted for every variable. The bloodline will serve, whether willingly or not." Sarah felt the moment of choice arriving, the crucial instant when her decision would determine the fate of everyone present. She could see Mike desperately working to free the prisoners, could feel the entity pressing against the dimensional barrier with growing urgency. The shattered crown lay within her power to claim, its fragments containing enough concentrated spiritual energy to either complete the cult's working or turn their own power against them. Margaret's voice whispered in her mind, "Choose quickly, child. The moment is upon us." Sarah's hand closed around the fragments of the shattered crown, and immediately she understood the true scope of what Margaret had built into this place. The obsidian pieces weren't just remnants of the cult leader's defeat. They were components of a purification system that had been waiting over a century for activation. The moment her blood touched the broken crown, light erupted from every surface in the chamber. Not the cold radiance of the cult's artifacts, but something warm and cleansing that seemed to burn away the shadows that had accumulated in the compound's corners. The Phoenix Stone, as Margaret's memories named it, was designed to cleanse spiritual corruption on a massive scale. "Impossible," the cult leader gasped, his partially transformed body convulsing as the purifying energy washed over him. The crown was supposed to be indestructible, bound to our Lord's essence. "Margaret built a failsafe into everything," Sarah said, feeling her ancestors' knowledge flowing through her consciousness. "She knew you would eventually return, would try to use her sanctuary for your own purposes. So she prepared for this exact moment." The Phoenix Stone's power spread outward from Sarah's position, following the spiritual architecture Margaret had woven into the compound's foundations. Every cursed artifact, every binding spell, every thread of dark influence began to unravel under its purifying touch. Sarah watched as the cult members throughout the chamber began to change. Those who had served willingly screamed as decades of accumulated corruption burned away, leaving them fully human but bearing the weight of their crimes. Others, who had been coerced or manipulated into service, collapsed in relief as supernatural compulsions released their grip on mind and soul. "The prisoners!" Mike shouted over the growing radiance. "Sarah, they're still connected to the ritual circle." Sarah could see the threads of dark energy that bound the captives to the summoning bowl, spiritual chains that would drag them into death as the ritual collapsed. But the Phoenix Stone's power offered another option. If she could redirect its purifying energy through those same connections. Working with Margaret's accumulated knowledge, Sarah began to trace new patterns in the air, her movements carving channels through which the cleansing light could flow. It was delicate work, requiring her to maintain the Phoenix Stone's activation while simultaneously rewiring the cult's spiritual machinery. "What are you doing?" the cult leader demanded, his transformation reversing as the entity's influence was burned away by the stone's radiance. "You cannot unmake what has been wrought across centuries." "I'm not unmaking it," Sarah replied, sweat beading on her forehead from the effort of maintaining multiple supernatural workings simultaneously. I'm repurposing it. Every connection you built to drain spiritual energy, every binding you created to control minds, I'm turning them into channels for liberation. One by one, the prisoners began to stir as the threads connecting them to the summoning bowl transformed from chains into lifelines. Instead of draining their life force, the modified ritual circle began to heal them, restoring vitality that had been slowly siphoned away over months or years of captivity. The cult leader made a desperate lunge towards Sarah, his partially human form still retaining enough supernatural strength to pose a serious threat. But Margaret's spirit materialized between them, no longer confined to the bloodstone pendant, but manifesting as a fully corporeal guardian. "You have plagued this world long enough," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent over a century preparing for this confrontation. "Your time of influence ends here." The Phoenix Stone's purifying light reached its crescendo, and Sarah felt the entity that had orchestrated the cult's activities for centuries finally lose its grip on the physical world. Cut off from its network of human servants and cleansed of the spiritual anchors that had allowed it to influence events across dimensions, the creature was banished back to whatever realm it had originated from. "It's done," Sarah said, feeling the Phoenix Stone's power begin to stabilize. "The connections are severed. The entity can't return." Around the chamber, cult members who had served unwillingly were helping to free the remaining prisoners, while those who had chosen corruption willingly sat in stunned silence, finally comprehending the true cost of their allegiance. The compound's spiritual architecture had been fundamentally transformed, its network of dark energy converted into a protective barrier that would prevent similar workings in the future. Margaret's ghostly form approached Sarah, pride and gratitude shining in her spectral features. "You've done something I could never accomplish alone," she said. "You've not only stopped them, you've healed the wounds they inflicted on reality itself." Mike reached Sarah's side, pulling her into an embrace that grounded her in the physical world after her journey through supernatural realms. "Is it really over?" he asked. Sarah looked around the transformed chamber, seeing former cult members helping to free prisoners, watching as decades of accumulated evil was literally burned away by purifying light. "The immediate threat is over," she said. "But there will always be others who seek this kind of power. The difference is that now we have the tools to stop them." The Phoenix Stone continued to glow in her hands, its light promising hope for a future free from the shadows that had haunted her bloodline for generations. 6 months had passed since the events at the mountain compound, and Sarah still found herself marveling at how ordinary life could feel after confronting cosmic horror. She and Mike had returned to their apartment, rebuilt their routines, and slowly learned to sleep through the night without checking shadows for threats that no longer existed. The wooden memory box sat on their kitchen table, simple and unadorned except for Margaret's initials carved into its lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in blessed cloth, were the artifacts that had changed their lives. The Phoenix Stone, now dormant but still warm to the touch, fragments of the purified crown, and the bloodstone pendant that had become Sarah's inheritance and responsibility. "The FBI wants to interview us again next week," Mike said, reading from an official letter that bore Agent Chen's replacement signature. "Third time this month." Sarah nodded absently, her attention focused on the morning news report playing on their television. Another cult had been exposed in Oregon, their leader claiming to serve an ancient entity that promised power in exchange for sacrifice. It was becoming a disturbing pattern, as if the defeat of their particular enemy had somehow encouraged others to attempt similar workings. "Different entities," she murmured, recognizing the signs from her enhanced understanding of supernatural threats, but following the same playbook: recruitment, corruption, ritual sacrifice, dimensional bridging. The federal task force established in the aftermath of their ordeal had been surprisingly effective, Sarah had to admit. With her testimony and the evidence recovered from the compound, they had identified and dismantled cult cells in 17 states. Former members who had been freed from supernatural compulsion proved invaluable in tracking down the network's remaining tentacles. Mike poured coffee into the mug that had become Sarah's favorite. A simple ceramic piece they'd bought at a garage sale the week after returning home. Normal things had taken on special significance since their ordeal. Reminders that life could be simple and peaceful if one worked to preserve those qualities. "Mrs. Chen called yesterday," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Her son David is doing well in the rehabilitation program. The doctors think he'll make a full recovery from the psychological conditioning." Sarah smiled at that news. David Chen, no relation to the corrupt agent who had shared his surname, had been one of the prisoners they'd rescued from the compound. Like many of the cult's victims, he'd been slowly drained of spiritual energy over months of captivity, leaving him in a state that conventional medicine couldn't address. But the Phoenix Stone's purifying influence had proven remarkably effective at healing such wounds. "And the others?" she asked. "Jennifer Walsh is back in college, finishing the degree she started 20 years ago. The Nguyen family received full compensation for their house and bought a new place in California. Even Harold's nephew sent a thank-you card. Apparently the old man left him everything in his will, along with a letter explaining what really happened." Sarah picked up the morning paper, scanning headlines that had become routine reading since developing her enhanced awareness of supernatural threats. Most were ordinary crimes and political scandals, but she'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that suggested otherworldly influence, patterns of behavior that defied psychological explanation, crime scenes that contained elements no earthly perpetrator would think to include. "Here," she said, pointing to a small article buried on page 6. "Missing hikers in Colorado. 3 separate disappearances, all experienced outdoorsmen, all vanished from areas with no history of accidents." Mike read over her shoulder, his expression growing serious. "You think it's another cult? Or something pretending to be one?" Sarah had learned that the defeat of their particular entity had created something of a power vacuum in certain supernatural circles. Opportunists and imitators were attempting to establish themselves, using copied rituals and stolen artifacts, most without understanding the true forces they were meddling with. She opened the memory box and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. Over the past 6 months, she had been documenting everything she remembered from her enhanced state, creating a comprehensive guide to recognizing and combating supernatural threats. Margaret's knowledge had faded as the immediate crisis ended, but the lessons learned remained. "We should probably look into it," she said. Though part of her longed to remain in the comfortable normalcy they'd rebuilt. Mike raised an eyebrow. "Sarah, we're not supernatural investigators. We're a couple who got caught up in something horrible and managed to survive it." But even as he spoke, they both knew the truth. The experience had changed them in fundamental ways, given them knowledge and abilities that came with inescapable responsibility. They had become something new, guardians not in Margaret's immortal sense, but as ordinary people committed to protecting others from extraordinary dangers. Sarah closed the memory box, feeling the artifact's quiet power through the blessed wood. They would go to Colorado, would investigate the disappearances, would probably discover another group that had stumbled onto forces beyond their comprehension. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had chosen, and somewhere in the space between ordinary and extraordinary, Sarah had found her purpose.